Hey y'all, welcome back. Today we're doing part 2 of How the Music Hall Skiffle and British Rock and Roll Conquered the World by Andy Edwards. If you've not seen part 1, check it out. There's some pretty fascinating revelations about British music that I didn't know about. Apparently, music and comedy were much more entwined. They were married together long ago because of British folk music that was around. And we just left off on George Forby, who was a ukulele banjo player who the Beatles loved. George Harrison was the head of his kind of a fan club, like appreciation club.
And so the ukulele banjo that then became an instrument that many people start to learn to play on, myself included, has a certain influence here in the United Kingdom, which I think is different to the influence that musicians would have had in America. Of course, the Beatles were huge fans of George Formby, and George
Crazy.
Harrison was a head of the George Formby Appreciation Society.
Right.
So Chris Barber bringing in Lonnie Donegan to play banjo in the early 50s is almost like a no-brainer. The British people love that sound. The great jazzman Ken Collier had been stuck in New Orleans, actually in prison, I believe, on visa problems. He couldn't get back to the United Kingdom. When Ken Collier did arrive back, he went back and joined Chris Barber's band, and he came bringing all this knowledge and history from New Orleans. It was then that he turned around and suggested that they have a sort of jug band American folk section within the Chris Barber Ken Collier stage show. And Lonnie Donegan was put in charge of pulling this together. Now, this, I believe, is the unique aspect of British popular music that makes the band so awesome that emerged in the 1960s. Lonnie Donegan, as well as loving traditional jazz, had been influenced by a whole host of different musicians that had come out of America and been very popular all over the world.
Hang on. I know the name Lonnie Donegan, but I'm at a loss for why I know Lonnie Donegan. Just look him up real quick. British skiffle singer, songwriter, musician, referred to as the King of Skiffle. Okay. He began his career in the British jazz revival, but transitioned to skiffle in the mid-1950s. Okay, yes. This guy's about to create skiffle, y'all.
I would reduce these down to 3 musicians, and these 3 musicians are absolutely monumental in the history of popular music. The first would be Leadbelly, discovered by John and Alan Lomax in the 1930s. He came out of prison where he'd been serving his time from a murder, and basically brought a whole host of different American songs that went beyond just simple jazz and blues into all sorts of nursery rhymes, children's songs, spirituals, comedy songs. He seemed to embody all of this. He was a virtuoso guitar player and an incredible singer.
He murdered someone and then got out of jail, prison. I didn't know that. In the first part, we discovered that Leadbelly was from Shreveport, or he lived in Shreveport for a while, and he probably saw the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band play. This was a group of kids in the streets of Louisiana, or in the streets of New Orleans, who made their own instruments, and they started playing around town, and people loved it, apparently. Wish I could hear it, but it was a big influence, and he probably heard them play in Shreveport. They got stranded in Shreveport. And we're busking for money. Crazy.
And he transmitted these songs all over the world. He was befriended by a guy called Woody Guthrie. Now, Woody Guthrie was a white middle-class folk singer in America who took these songs of Leadbelly and added a political element to them. Of course, influencing Bob Dylan. And that line through Woody Guthrie really is the nuclear reactor of rock music. And
I had no idea Woody Guthrie even knew who Leadbelly was. Wow.
Really is the nuclear reactor of rock music. And when Dylan brings these ideas in the early 1960s, this idea of the protest song in America giving a voice to American youth, as Bob Dylan did, really is the impetus for rock and roll to become more serious and become rock music. But there's something different going on here in the UK. Lonnie Donegan was a huge fan of Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie, but he was also a great fan of another contemporary of those two who was friends with them, and that is the great Joshua Daniel White.
Oh, I never heard of him.
There's a blues about a man. Well, a train took his baby and left, and he's a very sad man. And he tries to give you the effect of a train happening and how you felt deep down inside. And the name of the song is Number 12 Train, and it goes something like this.
Cigarette. Keep that haircut short. Damn. Hang on, is he saying that skiffle came from the sound of a train? That's blowing my mind. A lot of music comes from the rhythms of nature, but this is coming from the rhythms of technology. That's f***ing wild. F***ing wild, y'all. I had no f***ing idea. Wow. I want to rewind it a bit. I think he's still going to play some more. It sounds like a train.
Who was an American singer, guitarist, and songwriter. He was also an actor and a civil rights activist. This guy, in 1944, had the first million-selling single in America by a black gentleman, a black musician. He created a style of music that drew on what we could call the jug band, which is something that had originated in 1920s America. Now, the jug band is basically identical to what Emile Lacombe was doing with the Razzie Dazzie Spasm Band. And I have tried to research into this. Everybody who reports on this talks about the jug bands emerged in the 1920s. Now, the jug bands, again, was this sort of homemade music style with people, creating rhythms by blowing into jugs. They would also, use things like nose whistles and all sorts of homemade instruments.
Oh my God. Okay. So the Razzie Dazzie Spasm Band, like I said, these were New Orleans street urchin children, feral children, made their own instruments from garbage. And one of the instruments was a jug. And that caught on. Wow, this is fascinating. Okay.
The reason why we probably go to these bands as being the first is because these were the first to record in the 1920s. Jug bands from Louisville, Kentucky were the first to record. And probably we could lay the claim for this to the violinist Clifford Hayes' Old Southern Jug Band, which was recorded as early as 1923. Whistler and his jug band often making use of a nose whistle, first recorded in September 1924 for Jeanette Records. Herbert Donner's original Louisville Jug Band and Dixieland Jug Blowers were also among the first to record.
What's a nose whistle? I have a good idea what it might be, but I don't know exactly. Nose whistle. What? Nose whistle.
Here's that interesting little instrument I promised I'd play for you. You ready to hear what it sounds like?
Yeah. How are you doing that? What's this guy doing? Okay. That's a nose whistle.
The vaudeville blues singer Sarah Martin and the blue yodeler Jimmy Rogers both employed these bands for their recording. I think Lonnie Donegan had been asked to basically recreate those types of bands, but his influence that had informed him was from Joshua White. Now, it's worth mentioning another American artist that was influencing the trad jazz in the 1940s. Dan Burley started out his music career playing Chicago house rent parties, blues cafes, socials, and other clubs. His barrel house playing has been said to have influenced Humphrey Lyttelton with his band Penny Blues. And anybody who listens to Humphrey Lyttelton's band Penny Blues will hear the scenes of Lady Madonna by the Beatles. So there's a line coming in that is before the advent of rock and roll in the 1950s.
That's where the word skiffle comes
from. So with a washboard and a tea-chest bass and a cheap Spanish guitar, Lonnie Donegan played folk and blues, and he sung songs by Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie. This proved...
Hang on. What's this last guy? Chicken Shack Shuffle. Dan Burley and his Skiffle Boys. Bad Penny Blues. I gotta hear it. Yeah, y'all, it sounds like Lady Madonna. Wow. The feel of it, the melody's different.
Who listens to Humphrey Lyttelton's band Penny Blues will hear the scenes of Lady Madonna by the Beatles.
Wow.
So there's a line coming in that is before the advent of rock and roll in the 1950s. So with a washboard and a tea-chest bass and a cheap by Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie. This proved very, very popular, and in July 1954, he recorded a fast version of Leadbelly's Rock Island Line, featuring a washboard, but not a tea-chest bass. And on the B-side of that single was John Henry.
So I fooled you, I got pig iron, I got pig iron, I got all pig iron. He said, tell you where I'm going, boy. Where you going? Tell her. Going down the Rock Island Line, it's a mighty good road, yes indeed. Well, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a finally get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. Well, I may be right, I may be wrong. I know you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. Down the Rock Island Line, it's a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a finally get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line.
This proved a huge hit and predates rock and roll in America. He then went on to make the album An Englishman Sings American Folk Songs, which came out on the Mercury label. This skiffle boom predates rock and roll, and it informs rock and roll. Musicians that got into this style found that they could create a band amongst their friends with virtually no money, as long as they could find an old classical guitar, a washboard,
a jug,
tea-chest bass, they could start playing these songs. And these songs were fantastic. Leadbelly's songs were vital, exciting, they grooved. This was a really exciting time for music here in the United Kingdom. The musicians that decided to jump onto this style in the 1950s are the musicians that create rock music in the 1960s. Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, the Beatles, Roger Daltrey.
Wow.
All of these musicians started off in the skiffle craze.
It's crazy I can't imagine a time before rock and roll. It's hard for me to imagine, but these guys were around before it happened. Wow.
The skiffle craze contained a line back to American blues, to American folk, bypassing rock and roll slightly and supplying the genetic material required to make the jump over to blues. We can see that the popular music of the United Kingdom is holding its hands with American music.
Yeah.
And there is communication going back between both of these styles of music all the way through. I find this a much better explanation as to why the British bands, when they went back to America in the 1960s, were so successful, because actually this was a much more complex assimilation and integration of styles than people think.
Yeah, I guess the simplified story that we all hear is that rock and roll was created in the United States and that the British musicians heard it and made it better or put their own spin on it and then sold it back to America, like Jimmy Carr was saying. But really, they had the DNA of what was before rock and roll already in them. So then just switching over to rock and roll, just get some electric guitars, right? Basically. Wow.
The history of rock and roll in the United Kingdom is often belittled, but it also contains its own innovations, which was different to American rock and roll. In August 1956, Tony Crombie set up a rock and roll band. Now, Tony Crombie was a product not of the British trad jazz boom, but of the British modern jazz boom. Tony Crombie was a virtuoso jazz musician, as was his band. Tired of making no money, he decided to jump on this rock and roll craze in 1956, and he changed the name of his band to the Rockets.
I think I've heard of this guy in another video, something about British rock before the Beatles. I think this guy, Tony, what's his name? Tony Crombie. Yes.
Craze in 1956, and he changed the name of his band to the Rockets. This band also contained the bassist Jet Harris that would go on to form the Shadows a few years later.
Oh, wow.
The group was modelled after Bill Haley and the Comets and Freddie Bell and the Bellboys.
Okay.
But Tony Crombie's virtuosity meant that they could swing so hard, and they amped up the tempo with their tune Teach You to Rock, which was produced by Norrie Paramore and made the top 30 UK single chart in October 1956.
Okay.
October 1956, we have a different sounding, very British version of rock and roll. Now, it has to be said that many of our British rock and rollers were very derivative. And a whole other host of songs which have a certain guitar twang. This may have come out of Bert Weedon, who was a first British guitar hero, who was famous for his hit records in the late 1950s, and his book, A Tune a Day, which taught many guitarists, including Eric Clapton, how to play. So we now have this guitar-heavy British sound, which we then get to hear in the Shadows. The Shadows, the session scene in London in the 1960s. Musicians could make a living by going and playing on the latest James Bond soundtrack. If we look at the musicians that played on Goldfinger, for example,
Jimmy Page.
It's a virtual who's who of musicians that are going to go on to create rock music a few years
John Paul
later.
Jones.
It's my belief
George
that
Martin.
this history that I've just described, which is much more nuanced than we think, is why when eventually we got the Beatles, and the Beatles took those elements from George Formby, from the music hall, and took it back to America.
Yes.
They recognised something in there that was old but new, that they were aware of, but they also weren't aware of. And what I think it was the cheekiness. Britain had been in awe when Elvis Presley arrived on our shores in the late 1950s. This was like a being from another planet. But the same thing happened when the Beatles went to America in 1964.
Oh, wow.
What the Beatles brought to America was this idea of the everyman, the regular guy, the person that would get up and tell you stories in the music hall over 100 years before. Normal stories of normal people doing normal stuff. Comedy, irreverence, surrealness. The Beatles brought all those things, and I believe that this was also in the DNA of American folk music.
Yeah, the Beatles were funny. That made them endearing to audiences. That was in the DNA of the culture of music in Britain. Elvis wasn't that funny. I mean, he got some laughs, but the Beatles were funny. There's also something about when I listen to Beatles music, it's like it pulls me in. There's something endearing. It sounds like they're having a good time. There are some mistakes, but they keep it going. They keep on rocking. That sounds stupid. They keep on going, but it sounds like they're having fun.
Their stand-up comedy was was evidence of this tradition. And so the music that the Beatles took to America reminded the American people of something which they had sort of forgotten. And I think this is where the success comes from. There is an irreverence. There is a surreality to British music, which I find very endearing. In fact, one of the early rock and roll songs that I never mentioned was the tune from 1956, Blood Knocks Rock and Roll Call by the Goons. When we look at some of the early rock and roll stars in the United Kingdom, they are quite...
Oh, I think Peter Sellers was in that. It's a comedy group, and they made albums, and George Martin was the producer. And one of the reasons that the Beatles wanted to work with George Martin is because they had these Goons records, and they saw George Martin's name on it, right?
Quite strange. Our first homegrown talent, Tommy Steele, had his first hit with the Cavemen in 1956. And of course, one of our first rock and roll stars who's been forgotten in the mist of times was Wee Willie Harris, who can only be described as strange.
I remember that name. Wee Willie Harris. Oh, poor guy.
Ape every time I see you smile. I'm a ding dong thriller and I carry your cape and style.
Pretty strange.
I'm gonna flip you on the head and love you all the while.
Of course, the Americans had the same tradition with artists like Screaming Jay Hawkins and later on Tiny Tim. This aspect of popular music, the aspect of novelty, I believe, is never focused on. People want to see the big ideas. They want to see the grand narrative playing out in these music forms, when actually a lot of the time what makes something popular is something silly and funny that normal people can grab onto.
That's so true. That's so true. Weird Al Yankovic. I mean, there's a ton of them.
We saw that right at the beginning of this with the recording of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, whose Livery Stable Blues was basically an ode to a farmyard, with the instruments mimicking the sound of various animals in the farmyard. This tradition goes all the way through popular music. It's something that we must remember is very, very powerful, and it's something that unites these two forms of music together. So I find it very interesting with Jimmy Carr making this claim and linking stand-up comedy and popular music together. Where he is wrong is to believe that America is the fountain of all these things, and that the United Kingdom basically just appropriated it and threw it back. This is not the case, and actually the history is far more interesting than that.
Yes, it is. You know, this is making me think of Monty Python. I mean, how could you, like, they had so much music, right?
It's very pretty, you've got to admit it's cute. So all together, let it go.
Rock and rollers Eddie and Rick are keeping the spirit of rock and roll alive in their hometown of Ashford. Today they are raising their profile at the local shopping centre.
All right.
This is the big, best collection on 950 memorabilia at the start. Right.
Well, now 950 memorabilia display. Y'all well some memorabilia, you're going to get some rock and roll dancing. Thank you very much. You're more than welcome.
So we're going to take it. Here's on front to 1645.
We've lived in 950 since we own that high, but we all love to be the chicken and we listen to this shit.
There's roast chicken on like 1640 in the Spanish Civil War.
What? Wow. Those are horrible Elvis impressions, but they took it somewhere else, and I appreciate that.
Roast chicken on like 1640 in the Spanish Civil War.
Why is this funny?
Just throw some dog there.
Right below, on the floor.
Remember the 950, sir? Yeah. Here's somebody no bottom of 950. Thank you very much.
There's a little 950. It's always had spirit and all that stuff.
We got into the regional clock and build here right around. Don't think of it much.
What if you want 5, 6, 7, 8 all the way around that clock all night long?
All night long, 950 almost here.
Here we go, yeah.
What you got that for here?
Just a little Richie here. This is a hell, a little Richie. Woo! To the floor, hombre.
It's on the 950. Thank you very much.
Very much. Just rock and roll. Right. It's all rock and roll.
Just rock and roll, filming, yeah. Just wait.
It's just rock and roll. These are rock and roll berries.
Shake one just shake for cocktail. Shaking cocktail. No, feel glug. Choke. I had that something up in my chicken. I don't think of it much. What chicken he does. You show me one child chicken, not chicken. I don't think of it much for chicken.
All the name is chicken.
like chicken very much. We're going to sell them. Some CDs, man. I don't know. Just going to display them. We just show them all. It's not unfair fun.
Join Eddie and Rick next time when they enjoy a rock and roll picnic at the rear of the local social services department.
Wow. Andy, great work. Y'all be sure to go to Andy Edwards and like and subscribe. That was mind-blowing. After watching this, it makes it seem like an artist like the Beatles was inevitable, right? With the humor, the rock, but with the music hall influence, those chords. Wow. More people need to see this. We need to spread the word. Share this video with friends. I'm going to subscribe. And I'm going to like. Amazing. Andy, great work. Great insight. Wow, y'all. The humor is integral. Lead Belly saw the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band play in Shreveport. He was like, I like that. Woody Guthrie heard Lead Belly play. He's like, I like that. Bob Dylan heard Woody Guthrie. He's like, I like that. Josh White, who's an unsung hero of music, he needs more credit. What's his deal? He passed away in 1969. American singer, guitarist, songwriter, actor, and civil rights activist. This guy, great work, Josh, Mr. White. And then Lonnie Donegan came along. He's like, I like that jug band stuff. And he started rocking. He didn't even know he was rocking. And then the Quarrymen, the Beatles started a skiffle group called the Quarrymen, or John Lennon did, and then Paul joined, then George joined, and then Ringo joined. And they got electric guitars and took over the world with their humor. Their humor is a big part of it. Novelty is a big part of it. It gets swept under the rug a lot of times as unimportant. But that novelty and the humor is a big part of pop music, isn't it? I'm trying to think of pop music now, and there's not a lot of humor. Although there are a lot of rap songs that are really funny. Wow, y'all. This is great. I hope y'all enjoyed it too. This is mind-blowing. Well, y'all, cheers to Andy Edwards for making this video. Cheers to you, Andy, sir. Brilliant. Brilliant. He has 56,000 subscribers. Let's get him some more. Let's get him up there. Well, y'all, I'd like to thank my patrons. I'd like to thank my Buy Me a Coffee folks. Oh, thanks to Stephen Marsham for recommending this video as well. Thank you, Stephen. Yes, I'd like to thank my patrons. I'd like to thank my Buy Me a Coffee folks. Thank y'all for watching this with me, and I'll see you next time. Later.